We're studying what we're calling the passion of Paul, and we've not only looked at Paul's own personal passion, what he does for Christ as an apostle, but we're looking at the circle of friends, his partners. And this particular lesson I'm calling Titus the Troubleshooter. Titus is a very unique person, and Paul uses him in an amazing way in some of the most difficult, the biggest problems that he faced in his churches. What Paul is doing, he's like a good general. He uses his best soldiers as what we call shock troops. Shock troops. In other words, he puts them in the hottest part of the battle. Not because he doesn't like them, but he knows that they are able to handle the problem. They're able to deal with the difficulty. And so if some of the assignments that God gives to you in life are difficult assignments, if they are some very difficult places, it might just be because God knows you can handle it. You can take care of some of the difficult problems. Other people, they have to have easier, they can't handle the tough ones. But thank God for Titus. Not everybody can be a Titus, but oh, how we need them in our life. And so this is what Paul does with Titus. He becomes one of Paul's most valuable team players, that he uses him, and I'm going to show you 5 different scenes in Titus' life where he puts him in these difficult problems because he knows Titus can handle this. Titus will take care of this problem. He shows us and reminds us again and again, it's always too soon to quit. So let's look at the problems. Here's the first one I see. It's what I will call the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem Council. It says in Acts the 15th chapter, verses 1 and 2, and certain men came from Judea. These are Jewish Christians that have come up from Judea now to Antioch. And they taught the brethren, saying, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Oh, be careful about that. Anytime you start adding anything to the cross, you get yourself in trouble. And so what they're doing, they're adding circumcision, saying you can't be saved unless you are circumcised like a Jew. Therefore, it says Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension. That's a nice way of saying it was a big church argument. That's what it was. No small dissension and dispute with them. And what they did, the church determined to send Barnabas and Saul back to Jerusalem about this problem. But notice what happens. In Galatians, the 2nd chapter, Paul is writing about the same thing, and he says, after 14 years, this is after the ministry there in Antioch, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, talking about the same incident back in Acts 15. And I took Titus with me. Now note that. He doesn't just go with Barnabas. He says, Titus, come here. I've got a job for you. I've got something I need you to do. I took him with me and communicated to them, to the 12 apostles and those in Jerusalem, the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now put yourself in his situation. How would you like to be Titus? And they bring you in before the 12 apostles to interrogate you, to question you, to talk with you and see if you really are a genuine Christian. That's what's happening here. The church at Jerusalem was divided over this issue, and it's very logical because all of these believers were Jews first. They had all been Jews before they became followers of Jesus, the new Messiah, before they became what we now call Christians. Remember, were called Christians first at Antioch. And so, because these Jewish believers in Jerusalem had first been Jews before Christians, they thought everybody else had to do the same thing that they did. That everybody had to be a Jew first. And of course that is not true, and that's exactly what Paul and Barnabas are arguing with them. No, what you're trying to do is make Jews out of everybody. We're trying to make Christians out of them. And there was a big difference. Their Class A model, their example of this is Titus. Here he is. Ask him any question you want to ask him. See if he's really genuine, if he truly loves Jesus, if he's a true believer. That's the situation they had put them in. Now, what these Jewish believers are trying to do was impossible. They're trying to mix law and grace, and it doesn't mix. Those are opposites, and Paul knew that that was impossible, that Jesus had fulfilled the law of Moses. Remember what Jesus said? I did not come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it. And he had. Every requirement of all the law of Moses was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And Paul knew none of us are going to be able to live up to that standard. None of us are going to be able to live like the Messiah. He's going to have to live this through us. By grace, through faith, we are saved. Paul saw that very clearly. But all of these original Jewish believers in Jerusalem are struggling with that. And so as Paul takes Titus with him, this is the first test in Titus' spiritual life by Paul. His first test. And he takes him in as a model Christian. And the way that Paul writes it in Galatians 2, yet not even Titus, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, the issue in Jerusalem was about doctrine. What Titus learned was submission. I find it very interesting that Paul and Barnabas went back to the original 12 and presented it to them. They believed that these men of God would come up with the right answer, and they did. And they wrote the letter. Of course, you can read it in Acts, the 15th chapter, sent it back to Antioch and said, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian. Thank God for that. Thank God for that. So that's the first test in his life. Here's the second one. The second one is what I'm going to call the Corinthian Confusion. And I think that's very aptly titled and named because it is a confusing issue. When Paul went to Corinth to begin to preach the gospel, the Bible said he found a very wide open door to preach. And as Jesus even appeared to him in a vision in night and appeared to him and said, speak, there's many people I have in this city. In other words, this was an open place for the gospel, but it also was a very immoral city. A very immoral city. And that affects the Christians. That affects the church. In the book of 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter and verse 1, Paul writes to the church at Corinth, and he said, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality that it's not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. Now, this is a very shocking, immoral situation. We're not talking about his mother here. It doesn't say it was his mother. Obviously, his father had remarried. And it's his stepmother. But he had taken his stepmother away from his father and was living in an immoral relationship with her. Paul said, that's not right. And when he gets that report, you know what he says? Come here, Titus. I got a job for you. Now, put yourself in Titus' shoes. How would you like to be put in that situation? Now, the reason this situation has created is because of the environment. Corinth was the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire. It was a seaport, and seaports are known for sailors coming in from being on the ships for long periods of times and wanting to party and have a big time. And so it was an immoral seaport city. In fact, there were 1,000 religious prostitutes in the city. That's how perverted and immoral it was. We're not just talking about immorality, but this was their way of worshiping certain gods, was that you had sex with the priestess of that god. And so there were 1,000 of these religious prostitutes in that city. The name Corinth, it actually was turned into a verb by a lot of people. They began to talk about Corinthianize. What did they mean by Corinthianize? They meant to morally destroy someone. They meant to just ruin them of their moral standards. And so the very name, Corinth, which was a noun, was turned into a verb to Corinthianize someone. That's where Paul sends Titus. Now, Paul had started this church, but after he left the church, soon serious problems began to arise. This is one of those problems. And so he sends the best man that he's got to deal with the situation. Now, here's where it becomes so confusing to us. Let me break it down. There's actually 4 letters we know that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. There are 3 trips that Paul makes. Now, if you can get that straight in your thinking, it helps you understand. Here's the first one. Paul writes a letter we do not possess. We don't have any copies of it. You find it mentioned in 1 Corinthians, what we call 1 Corinthians. Actually, there was a letter preceding that, because he said, I wrote to you in my letter, my epistle, not to keep company with sexually immoral people. 1 Corinthians 5 and 9. We don't have a copy of that letter. We don't know what happened to it, but it was not preserved for us. The Corinthians respond by writing a letter back to Paul. The letter that they write back is referenced in the book of 1 Corinthians. He writes this letter, then we call 1 Corinthians, in response to their letter, and he sends it back to Corinth with Timothy. Let me give you a couple of scripture references to prove what I'm saying here. 1 Corinthians 4 and 17. For this reason I have sent Timothy to you, who will remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach everywhere in every church. In the 7th chapter and verse 1, he says, now concerning the things which you wrote to me. Now notice this. Paul has written them a letter about don't keep company with sexually immoral people. They have written back to Paul. Now Paul is responding in what we call 1 Corinthians and sends it to Corinth by the hands of Timothy. The problem was the Corinthians didn't receive it. They rejected both Paul's letter and Timothy. And Timothy comes back saying, it was not a successful ministry. I wasn't able to solve this problem. So guess what Paul does? Paul then, after Timothy returns to him, Paul then makes a second trip to Corinth. After he comes from this trip, he sits down and he writes a third letter. Again, we don't have a copy of that letter. We don't know the details because it was not preserved for us. He sends this third letter to Corinth by Titus. Now put yourself in Titus' shoes. I mean, Paul has not been able to solve this problem. They've rejected his letters, and Timothy was not able to solve this problem. And Paul's saying, come here, Titus, I've got a job for you. How would you like those kind of assignments where other people are failing, other people can't get it done, and yet he wants to give it to you? I think sometimes I want to say, no thanks, I don't need that kind of a job. But thank God for Titus. Thank God for men and women that can take the tough assignments. In 2 Corinthians, which actually would be the 4th letter that Paul has now written to this church, Paul says, and I wrote this thing to you, lest when I came I should have sorrow over those whom I ought to have joy, because they have, they've not corrected the problem. He goes on to say, furthermore, when I was at Troas to preach Christ's gospel, a door was opened to me by the Lord. In other words, I had a great opportunity there for ministry. But I had no rest in my spirit because I did not find Titus, my brother. In other words, he's not heard anything from Corinth. What's happening there? Titus has not returned, and he's so concerned about it that he's ready to go searching for Titus. But he goes on to say in the 7th chapter of 2 Corinthians, nevertheless, God comforted us by the coming of Titus. He's come back from Corinth. And by the consolation which he was comforted in you, when he told us of your earnest desire, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even the more. For even if I made you sorrow with my letter, I do not regret it. He says, I did regret it, but I've got over that. For I perceive that this same letter that made you sorrow was only for a while. Now, what's happening here is Titus has come back to Paul with good news. And he says, Titus says, you have received my gospel. You've received the letter. You've accepted the apostolic authority for correcting this immoral problem. He goes on to say in the next verses of the 7th chapter, therefore we have been comforted, and we rejoice exceedingly more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all, and his affections are greater for you as he remembers the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling you received him. In other words, Titus has passed the test. Titus has done what Paul and Timothy could not do. And so then Paul ends the book of 2 Corinthians by saying, this third time I'm coming to you. That is where we know for sure that he makes 3 visits there. And by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established. Now thank God for Titus. The issue at Corinth was over morality. Titus learns purity. He learns how to keep himself unspotted, untainted by the immorality of this most immoral city in the Roman Empire. That was a big assignment. Let me give you the third one. Again, it goes back to Corinth again, but it's about money. Boy, 2 of the biggest problems that you're going to have to deal with in life is about sex and about money. It just comes up again and again in the church, in ministry. The missionary offering. In 2 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, Paul mentions this. Now, concerning the ministering to the saints, in other words, an offering they were receiving to send to the church at Jerusalem. I know your willingness, about which I have boasted to the Macedonians, that Achaia, this is Corinth, another name for Corinth, was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect. Now, he goes on to say, and he's detailing how you've got to deal with problems about money. In the 9th chapter, verses 4 and 5, lest if some Macedonian should come with me and find you unprepared, in other words, your offering's not ready, that we should be ashamed. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, that it might be as a matter of generosity and not an grudging obligation. Now notice what he's doing. 1 year before, he had written to them about participating in this missionary offering they were going to send to help the poor saints in Jerusalem. He's written to them about that, and the Corinthians respond enthusiastically. You find some churches are this way. They really get excited about things, emotional about things, and so they make a big pledge offering. But there's a difference between a pledge offering and the actual cash. The problem was their zeal had exceeded their commitment to fulfill the promise. Now, one of the problems that we have to deal with in ministry all the time, talk can be very cheap. People talk by the mile, they walk by the inch. There's a big difference in talking and walking. And people make pledges. They promise things, and then they don't keep their promise. That's what's happening here. And so Paul realizes if we don't deal with this correctly, this is going to become not only a problem and embarrassment for the church at Corinth, it's going to be a discouraging problem for all the churches, because they thought that Corinth was leading in this missionary offering, and so he sends them to make sure that things are ready. Now notice what he's done. He sent, number one of his best men. He sent Titus. He sends with him another brother that was approved by the churches. When you start dealing with money matters, you better be very careful who is your treasurer. Or you might end up as Judas carrying the money. That always becomes a problem because Judas will keep part of it for himself. It's always a problem. So you've got to be very careful who's handling the money. And so he says in the 8th chapter of 2 Corinthians, I urge Titus that as he had begun, he would also complete this grace in you. And he says, Titus not only accepted it, in other words, come here, Titus, I got something else I need you to do. Titus went to you of his own accord. He volunteered. Boy, I love those kind of soldiers. I love those kind of men and women that will volunteer. Here I am, send me for the tough assignments. We're not talking about, something that's easy here. We're talking about something very touchy, very difficult here. And he said, I sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel through all the churches. Now note that. He sends another brother with him. But then you notice in 2 Corinthians 8 chapter and verse 19, he says, not only that, who was also chosen with the church to travel with us in this gift, which was administered to us. Avoiding this, anyone should blame us for this lavish gift. This is a lot of money, in other words. This is a big gift that was administered by us, providing honorable things no longer only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. That is a key phrase. When you're dealing with money, never deal with it alone. Why? Because there's no way that you can prove your accountability. Never give one person the job of counting the money. Always send two. And somebody said, well, you don't trust anybody. I don't trust my flesh. How can I trust yours? I was counseling a young man, and he and his wife having marital difficulties one day, and all of a sudden he looked at me with his eyes got big, and he said, well, you don't even trust me. I said, exactly right. I can't trust my flesh. How can I trust yours? When you're dealing with money, you've got to go the extra mile. So notice what he's saying. Providing things that are not only honest with God, that's where it begins, but also it's honest in the sight of men, where nobody can ask questions about what you're doing. Now listen to me carefully here. When you start dealing with problems, anybody can lead when there's no problems. But when you come to problems, that's when you find out who the true leaders are. Because the true leaders will be able to navigate through those difficult situations. So Paul not only sends Titus, one of his best, he sends with him this brother that was approved. But then notice he goes even beyond that. It says in 2 Corinthians 8:22, and we have sent with them, with Titus and this brother that was approved, our brother whom we have approved diligent in many things. Notice, he's sending 3 to deal with this problem about the money. Oh my. Why? Why would he go the extra mile? Because he's talking about money here. And when you start dealing with money, you've got to go beyond what we would consider ordinary or the usual practice. You've got to go the extra mile. So he sends Titus and 2 more brothers that were approved by the churches who had good reputation to deal with this problem. I've said it so many times. They may go to sleep when you're teaching. They may go to sleep when you're preaching or even during the singing. But I promise you, nobody sleeps when they're counting the money. Nobody. That's why Paul is dealing with this. And so the issue, it's over money. And what he learns, Titus learns integrity. Keep your integrity. Oh my, I wish I could say it clearer than this, because this is going to be one of the biggest problems you're going to face in your life, in your ministry, in your churches, is dealing with the money. Make sure you go the extra mile. Do it like Paul did with Titus. All right, the third thing I want to talk about is the Cretan church. The Cretan church, this was a difficult church in that he says in Titus 1 and 5, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you." What we believe has happened is that Paul has been released from prison and has gone to Crete with Titus, and they've done evangelism. Paul then needs to leave. He leaves Titus behind in the island of Crete to set the churches in order. Now, Crete was the largest island in the Mediterranean Sea. And so, as he's established these churches, he can no longer stay there, so he leaves one of his best men. "Come here, Titus. I've got something I want you to do. Organize the churches that are in Crete." Now, evangelism can be very exciting, but organizing the churches, now it can get real sticky. Titus is having difficulty with these people. In fact, hear what Paul says in Titus 1:12 and 13. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." And then Paul says, "This testimony is true. Therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith." Now, how would you like to pastor that church? How would you like to be trying to set this church in order? I mean, they are liars, they're evil beasts, they are lazy gluttons. That's not a real good description for churches. And yet that's what he's saying. "Come here, Titus. I got a job for you. I've got something for you to do." And he sends him there. Titus gets discouraged with this, and I think I would too. He wants to leave and rejoin Paul, and let's do some more evangelism. Let's go preach the gospel to somebody else. Paul says, "Stay there and finish the job." Wow. You can only do that with people like Titus. Some people cannot handle that kind of pressure. But thank God for Titus. Titus was able to organize it, and church history records, years later, Titus goes back to the church in Crete and becomes the bishop over the churches that are there. Thank God for Titus. How we need shock troops like this that can get the job done. The issue at Crete was about discouragement. He wanted to quit, but he learned the lesson of faithfulness. Be faithful. Be faithful. That's what he is learning in this. The last point that I want to make is what I'm going to call the Dalmatian Dilemma. The Dalmatian Dilemma. We really don't know much about this situation. It's only referenced one time, and it's in Paul's last letter. He's writing to Timothy. He says in 2 Timothy 4 and 10, "Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed for Thessalonica. Cretans has gone to Galatia. Titus for Dalmatia." That would be it's in the center of what we call the Balkan nations. That's where he was sending them. him there. One of those countries there, Albania rather, or what used to be called Yugoslavia, in that particular section of the world. Titus has gone to Dalmatia. What's he going? We don't know. We don't know anything about the problem. All we know, whatever the problem was, Paul's sending him. Paul's in prison. His execution date's already set, and he knows. And so he's saying, I'm here alone, come quickly. And he begins naming the different ones where they were. And he says, Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Whatever the problem was, we don't know. But we know Paul sent one of his best men to fix it, to solve it. You're never going to be successful in ministry alone. The only way that you're going to be able to accomplish what God has called you to do, to fulfill your destiny, your purpose, you're going to have to build a team. And as I've said, not everybody can be a Titus, but thank God for Titus. If you don't have people like this on your team, you will not be able to deal with the difficult problems in life. Just like Titus, when he takes him to Jerusalem, or he sends him to Corinth about the immorality, or he sends him to Corinth to collect the pledge offering, or as he sends him and leaves him in Crete with these difficult people. You've got to learn how to deal with these kind of people if you're going to be successful in life. You must have people like Titus on your team. We have an expression here in the United States about the Marine Corps, and it says, we're looking for a few good men. I believe that is the same in the kingdom of God. Not everybody can be a Titus. Not everybody can do this. Even Timothy failed at the attempt to minister in Corinth, but Titus was able to handle it. If we're going to be able to accomplish the difficult problems in life, we're going to have people like Titus on our team. Now, what Titus shows us over and over and over again, it's always too soon to quit. You've got to have people that just refuse to quit. They stay with the job until it is finished. They refuse to allow anything to discourage them to the point of quitting and going home. Remember how that Paul became so upset over John Mark because John Mark wanted to go back home to Jerusalem. I'm going back to Mama. This is too difficult for me. But not Titus. Titus was willing to do whatever was necessary to get the job done. Now, I want to encourage you. I think in my life that this is one of the things that God has called me to be. And man, I have had some tough assignments in life. And I realized God put me there because he believed I could handle it. I could take it. I could do it. And thank God I've been able to do it because I refused to quit. I encourage you in your spiritual journey, if you possibly can, become a Titus. Rise up to this challenge to take on the difficult assignments in life and say, I'll take the jobs nobody else wants to do. I'll take the hardest jobs. Give me those places on the battlefield, and I'll fight in the hottest part of the battle. We got to have that if we're going to fulfill the call of God upon our life. And so that's why I call him Titus, the troubleshooter, because every time you find him, Paul's putting him in a difficult situation. May God help us to rise to the challenge and become troubleshooters.